Hey folks, good morning. This is David Gretchen. We're still having a little bit of technical difficulties getting the files uploaded, but going to push forward, and we will either share that after or try to keep figuring out a way to make it happen while we're doing this. So my name is David Gretchen. I work for Edwards Pittman Environmental these days. I used to work for FHWA for a lot of years before retiring back in May and joining EP. So it's been almost a year now that I've been here. Going to talk about Section 4F today. You know, I've got slides. We'll at least be able to show them on the screen. 4F, very complex and controversial law. The goal for today, I was intending this to be a overview for non-environmental folks, the engineers and designers and project managers that are out there. So I know we have a lot of those folks on, and I know we also have a lot of environmental also. So, you know, for the environmental folks, hopefully this is a review, or if you're newer to the 4F ball game, and you know, you will get your experience today also. So
David, why don't I give you a few words, David?
Okay, go ahead, Eric.
All right, I had a little technical difficulty myself. I didn't have the invite, so you know, I want to appreciate everybody coming out. We've got a really good group here today, and so as David said, this is a non-environmental overview. But I want to kind of start off with a little bit of good news that we heard this week that the state of Georgia has been ranked second in the nation for the best roads and bridges by personal finance outlet Wallet Hub. Okay, and so what they did is they did a study focused on states with the best and worst taxpayer return on investment, and in the infrastructure category, Georgia ranked second in the nation. And so that's really a testament to everybody that's in this training, whether you are internal GDOT, whether you are one of our consultant partners. And I know we've got some state and federal agency folks here as well. You know, that includes you too, because we all have a role to play in making Georgia's infrastructure the best in the country. But, and you know, there is always a but to everything, is we still have challenges in the transportation planning process. And one of those challenges is with Section 4F of the U.S. DOT Act of 1966. You know, it's probably one of the most important laws that we have, but it's probably one of the most misunderstood laws that we have. And at times, you know, it's one of the most intimidating laws that we have. And I say that because I've been in many of meetings where just the mention of 4F and everybody throws their hands up and said, our project is dead right now at that point. And so it doesn't have to be that way. And so it's really good that everybody is here for this non-environmental overview. David introduced himself briefly there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about David. You know, David and I go way back back to the 1990s, and the only analogy that I can give is those two old guys in the balcony on the Muppet Show, right? And we have a relationship that's really similar to that as well. Unfortunately for me, I'm beginning to look like one of those guys up on the balcony, and David really hasn't aged very much. But back then in the 90s, you know, we were able to work together along with a number of great colleagues and external partners on a number of projects that were really unique. They were forward thinking. They were really the first of their kind, and that we received a lot of national recognition for those projects. You know, all those projects really had at their core a common shared goal to improve the efficiency of the environmental process. You know, when we started those projects, a lot of people said, you shouldn't try that, or you're not going to be able to get that done. And, we were able to get that done. I always appreciated and felt really fortunate to work with David, because if anybody knows David, he's kind of the roll up the sleeves kind of guy. He's real strong with and in notifying and letting people know the importance of communication. David himself never lost for words. But the good thing about David, he was always open to any idea that was going to improve the efficiency of the environmental process. And case in point, and he might have forgotten this, but I haven't. At one time we tried to buy an island off the coast of Georgia as a wetland mitigation project. And, that maybe wasn't our best idea, but it just goes to show you that, nothing was off the table when it came to really considering how to improve the efficiency of the environmental process. It was always about that common shared goal. And we learned really early that, working together was going to far surpass any good that we could do working in isolation. And what you're going to find out today, and I'm sure that David's going to really hit on this hard, is the importance of working together and communicating. Whether it's designer, engineer, project manager, environmental analyst, we all have to work in tandem to complete that the Section 4F process, always keeping in mind that common shared goal, trying to improve the efficiency of the environmental process. And, I started this meeting talking about, how we rank numbers the second in the country for our roads and bridges. But, I'm just going to add a little dose of reality here, is that, we can't be satisfied with second place. Our goal, our common shared goal for now should be having the best transportation facilities, the best transportation infrastructure in the country. And so that's going to take a lot of hard work. But, that hard work starts today with this training. And so this is the time where I've got to read David Grachen's bio. And if anybody knows David, David's bio barely fits on an 11 by 17 piece of paper, and that's single spaced. And to be quite honest with you, I don't have the energy to do that today. But I will tell you that David was the national subject matter expert on Section 4F for FHWA. And today he is the senior environmental manager at Edwards-Pittman. I thought that David was just another entry-level employee for Edwards-Pittman, but they have given him a special title. So, David, my good friend, I'll turn the floor over to you. You're on mute, Dave.
Yeah, I guess I was gonna have to start out with an apology, and now I have to have two apologies because I got to unmute first. So my computer's just blowing up because there's people in a different Teams meeting that are saying nobody's talking and they can't get. So if you're in that other meeting, obviously that's the wrong one. Draper has posted the link to this meeting. I don't have any idea how two different meeting links got sent out, but this is the only one that is active. So I've got Draper Suttles helping me out, and she's going to continue to try to get all those folks in this meeting. We had well over 200 people register for the meeting. Right now we've got, I don't even know how many participants. I'm not going to worry about that. This is the first time I've tried to do a Microsoft Teams webinar, so there's going to be a couple of hiccups, and again, I'll start off with apologizing for that. I'm going to turn my camera off and put the slides up that we're going to be using for the day and talk from them. Draper, does everybody see that then? All right, so that everybody should see the slide. For those of you that don't know me, I slammed my FHWA picture in there. And as Eric said, Eric, I appreciate those remarks. When I met Eric Duff, he was a staff archaeologist. I worked in Georgia from 1994 to 2005. I started with FHWA back in '87, so I put 34 years in with them prior to retiring 10 months ago. My degree is actually in civil, and when I started with FHWA back in the day, I was a asphalt and concrete technician and did construction inspections. And somehow or other in the early 90s, I got handed an environmental document, and pretty much for the rest of my career been working in environment. So because we have such a large audience, I mean, that's a good and a bad thing. The good thing is I get to broadcast this message to a lot of people, but the bad thing is there's not going to be a whole lot of opportunities for in-depth back and forth Q&As kind of thing. So I'm going to ask folks, if you have, everybody should be on mute now. And if you have a question or a comment, put it in the chat pod, please. And then I'll try to address as many of those as I can during the presentation. But if I can't get to all of them, I will commit to downloading that chat pod and preparing a response and then sending it out to the group afterward. I also had difficulty trying to upload a copy of the presentation slides. Why don't you email that to Sandy Lawrence? And then Sandy, if you would forward the email that Draper is going to send you with the slides, or I know Liz had sent it out to a large group. I know of no other way to get that in. So again, I apologize for that. Let's jump into it then. So this is what the 4F law says. And, originally 4F was part of the DOT Act in 1966. And this slide speaks to the Secretary may approve a transportation program or project requiring the use of publicly owned land of a public park, recreation area, or wildlife or waterfowl refuge, or land of a historic site of national, state, or local significance, yada, 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 only if there's no prudent and feasible alternative to using the land, and the program or project includes all possible planning to minimize harm. So we'll get into feasible and prudent a little bit later in this discussion, but these first two bullets, this is really what 4F was from 1966 up until 2005. So for nearly 40 years, we had this standard of not hitting something unless there was no way we could not go around it. And this is what you have to do when you're doing what's called an individual 4F evaluation. They are the most complex, the most time-consuming ways to comply with Section 4F. And that's why I asked that poll question earlier about, have you been in the transportation business longer than 16 years? So, 16 years ago, now 17, was 2005. And prior to 2005, 4F compliance was very different than what it is today. I will say there were many times, especially in the southeastern United States, that Section 4F and this substantive principle that says I can't hit it unless I prove I can't avoid it, forced us to make bad decisions. Why 2005 or why different? Well, this is where the or comes in. In 2005, Safety Lou, which was the transportation funding bill in that year, introduced what's called the de minimis impact finding. So if FHWA can say that the project has a de minimis impact on the 4F resources, then we've complied with 4F. De minimis is a Latin term. It means minor or trifling, so again, if we can make a finding that our project has only a minor impact on a 4F resource, we don't have to do the first two bullets about feasible and prudent avoidance. And that was a huge change for 4F compliance in 2005. I would say these days, probably upwards of 80% of the projects we do in 4F, maybe upwards of 90%, we do them with a de minimis finding. So one of the things I'm going to stress today to the engineering part of the audience is effective communication with your environmental counterparts to try to figure out what can we do to stay in that realm of it's a minor use of a 4F resource. Can we plant trees or build a wall to lessen our right-of-way footprint? You know, and how does the cost of doing something like that compare with the cost of saving 6 or 12 months of project development time? So before we get into all of that stuff, let's just take a minute and look at a little bit of history. So as I said, 4F came from the DOT Act in '66. You can thank your friends in Texas for the creation of Section 4F law. The Breckenridge Park was in San Antonio. There was a project to build a north-south route through town to connect the airport to downtown San Antonio, and it went through this park, or was proposed to go through this park. Lots of controversy, several lawsuits, and a lot of this was happening in the 1960s prior to a lot of the creation of the environmental laws. So there was a senator from Texas named Yarborough that introduced this caveat to federal aid funding that said, you know, it prohibited the taking of parklands for highways unless you could meet those thresholds of feasible and prudent avoidance that we spoke of earlier. So when 4F came out, the goal was total avoidance. The second bullet there is really important. So NEPA and Section 106 and a lot of the other Endangered Species Act, a lot of the other federal environmental laws apply to all federal undertakings. 4F only applies to actions of the US DOT agencies. So that federal nexus has to be back to the US DOT, back to FHWA or FTA or FAA. So, you know, I use the example, if you had a state-funded project and you needed a wetland permit, you needed a permit from the Corps, you'd be doing NEPA on that project. You'd be doing 106 on that project. You'd be doing Section 404, you know, to get your permit. But since there's no nexus to the US DOT, you wouldn't be doing 4F. The third bullet, 4F is a substantive law. You know, NEPA is procedural. NEPA is about the process. I can theoretically pick any alternative that's a reasonable alternative. I can pick A, B, or C. 4F is more than just process. That must prove no feasible and prudent avoidance. That's a substantive principle. And we've lost 4F lawsuits because we didn't meet that substantive part of the statute. So, excuse me. So, you know, lots of lawsuits. Again, you know, one of the earliest lawsuits that we had was Overton Park in Memphis, Tennessee, back in 1971. So, you know, this slide shows the area of Memphis that we're speaking about. You got I-40 that comes in from the east, was intended to go through Memphis and go out west to connect into Arkansas. And that green, another very controversial lawsuit in that same time frame, you know, 60s and early 70s. So in the center, this is Overton Park that's in the center of that planned facility. And as you can see, the road pretty much stops at the eastern boundary and goes around the park. You know, a interstate highway through the park was never built. FHWA and Tennessee DOT could not get over that substantive hurdle of feasible and prudent avoidance. So there are a lot of other examples around the country of where roads either were stopped or were built differently because of 4F law. 4F can drive an alternative. Here in Atlanta, Freedom Parkway, for those that know Atlanta's history, Freedom Parkway was supposed to be an interstate from the connector out to 285. And, that never happened. So this reinforces, one of the key messages I'm trying to emphasize today regarding the importance of designers and project managers talking effectively with the environmental staff to see, are there anything we can do so that we do not have to do an individual evaluation and do not have to meet that feasible and prudent standard. So let's talk a little bit more and dig a little bit deeper into this. So this is my 4F roadmap, and it outlays the process that we're going to speak to when we're complying with 4F. Up in the upper right corner, you see my US DOT vehicle. So again, that emphasizes the nexus to a DOT agency. My preaching to you, my advice to you is to follow this roadmap. We always start, if I can get my pointer, we always start up here. And one of our first steps is there something out there? Is there a 4F protected property? If there is something out there, we look at, are we using that property? And we're going to talk about this stuff, what these mean. If there's something out there and we use it, we get into these compliance options. We look at exceptions. We look at the minimis. We look at programmatics. And again, as our last opportunity, we end up doing an individual if we can't get to anything else. As you move from left to right across the bottom of this compliance options spectrum, things get much harder, take more time, and require a lot more environmental analysis and documentation. So I'm going to focus today on the left side of exceptions and de minimis and a little bit about programmatics. These days, probably 90 to 95% of the projects we do are not an individual evaluation. So again, whatever we can do, minimization and enhancement to not have to go down this far right path is going to be the most efficient way to comply with 4F and maintain a project schedule. Here's the law slide again, and I've highlighted right in the law, it tells you what a 4F protected property is. Thank you. I'm getting cough drops. My throat's already getting sore from all the pollen. But I said it earlier, publicly owned land of a public park, recreation, wildlife, waterfowl refuge, or land of a historic site. So my next slide shows that in same thing in a different way. There are two main categories of types of properties that are protected by 4F. Historic sites. And a historic site has to be on or eligible for the National Register. So the environmental staff and particularly the cultural resources staff will go through what's called a Section 106 process, or the National Register of Historic Places. They will evaluate the eligibility of these sites. And sometimes that involves consultation with other parties like tribes or consulting parties. You always have SHPO involved. But the point here is that not just anyone can do these studies. You have to be, qualified. You have to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. So, that's again where environmentalists and designers have to talk and know, is a site on or eligible for the register. For the parks, and I coin the term Parks Plus a lot because it's easier than saying parks, recreation areas, wildlife, and waterfowl refuges. But, the parks have to be publicly owned. They have to be a park that's open to the public. They have to be significant. So there's a lot of nuance in when you're looking at this applicability stage. Sometimes it's black and white. You know, if it's the so-and-so National Wildlife Refuge, or if it's, the Chattahoochee River, park that has swing sets and a playground and has parking area for the public. But there's a lot of other times when things get gray. So, the last thing on applicability, go through this process, spend some time, for the environmental folks, spend some time making sure what you have is a 4F protected resource. I can tell you more times than I'd like to admit, I've been called into a meeting with a state DOT and their consultants, and they're going through this analysis of all the alternatives they looked at to avoid something and minimize impacts and this and that. And, 15 minutes after sitting there, I asked them some questions about the property itself, and it turns out it's not a 4F protected resource. So, don't waste time and money jumping to step number 2 or 3, and make sure step number 1 is done correctly. The other side of that is, just want to make this point that even if something is not 4F, or it's not protected, it's not 4F, it's not applicable to it, it doesn't mean it might still be an important community resource. A military golf course is a publicly owned recreation area, but it's not open to the public. You have to be a member of the armed forces to get on it. So it's not a 4F protected resource. I had a project in North Carolina where there was a playground in a public housing complex. It was behind the fence. The only people that could get to the playground were people that lived in the neighborhood. It was owned by Mecklenburg County. It was publicly owned. It's not a 4F protected resource. You take a playground in a low-income community, that's going to be controversial. A resource like that is not a 4F resource. That resource gets addressed under our regular NEPA process. So that's my overview of applicability. Is there something out there? Excuse me. If there's something out there, we got to look at then, are we using that something? And use is a particular term, particular to 4F. In the simplest terms, you could speak to, are we acquiring right of way from it? Are we using it because we're changing it from 4F protected to future transportation facility? On the left-hand side, the alternative 2 that goes through the county park, that's going to be a use of that county park. We're changing, the land is permanently incorporated into the future transportation facility. That's the first bullet, a fee simple ownership, a permanent easement. Second bullet, temporary occupancy. If I'm only on it for a portion of the time, it may or may not be a use depending on what the outcome of that temporary occupancy is. If I am on a piece of land that is part of this 4F protected resource and it is just a grassed area, and I use it for staging or something else during construction, and then when I'm done using it, I regrade it and regrass it, and everything looks like it did before I got there, we probably can qualify for this temporary occupancy exception. It's not a use. If I am on the property and I need to cut down a bunch of trees, or, some other kind of close an entrance to a park or this or that kind of thing, then even though it's temporary, it probably is a use. So again, that's one where working through with the environmental types, good discussions to have. I have a slide about exceptions, and we'll talk a little bit more about how strategies to meet this temporary occupancy thing. The last bullet, constructive use. I'm certainly not going to get into that in any detail here, but we do spend time talking about that in our environmental in-depth trainings. Constructive use means I'm not on the property, but I am near it, and my impacts from what I want to do are so significant that they substantially impair the resource. So one of the best examples that I had of this from personal experience is we had a refuge and we were building a new road next to the refuge, and the noise from the new location road, there was concern it was going to affect the mating habitats of the species on the refuge. So we built a noise wall in front of a bunch of woods prior to building our road to mitigate that potential constructive use. So just want to, our cars moving down the road, we've gone through applicability and use, but I just want to reiterate, there's a lot of gray areas out there when you're talking about applicability and use, when you look at things like lease agreements and multi-use properties. And again, these are things we're going to discuss in depth during our in-person environmental training. Met with Sandy and Eric a couple days ago, just a last chance to talk about this training, and Eric had asked me to mention, the Ponce de Leon drainage project that I got involved in a few months ago. When I first came here to Edwards Pittman back in May, they were working on a drainage project, and it's out in Druid Hills. So, those that know that area, higher income, non-minority, the Druid Hills Historic District, lots of important resources within that. And GDOT was struggling with 4F compliance on this project since it caused an adverse effect to the district. One of the environmental planners brought it to me, and, very quickly after he showed it to me, I said, you don't need to be doing 4F on this project. So, the reasoning behind that really gets down into the weeds, of the conditions for, is there a use of the resource? But at the end of the day, it took me probably 2 months to convince GDOT and then ultimately Federal Highway that I wasn't crazy, but we ultimately got there. And, now not having to do 4F compliance on that project very much shortens the environmental project development timeframe. So, back in August, I went to SASHTO and saw Albert Shelby there and hadn't seen him in over 20 years. And he immediately said something to me like, hey, you worked on that Ponce de Leon project, nice job. So again, Eric wanted me to reinforce good communication between environment and designers about project scopes and designs and modifications and all that. Maybe there are some nuances out there that we can streamline environmental compliance when we're, doing these things. Okay, so again, I know I'm kind of working fast through this and hitting you with stuff coming out of the fire hose. So my intent is to, I'm not going to make all the engineers experts in 4F after 2 hours, but I want you to have a better awareness and, of the laws and the requirements, and, understand, hey, I remember him saying something about this. I'm going to call OES and let's talk about this in more detail, kind of thing. So the next slide I have, so we went through applicability, we went through use. There is something out there. One of the first things we want to do is see if we can take the slip ramp off to the left and see if we qualify for one of the exceptions. So there are these 7 exceptions, and the 23 CFR 774 is the FHWA's 4F regulations. So and 13 is where the exceptions are listed, and there's explanation of what those exceptions are. And if you meet an exception, you are accepted from making a 4F approval. It doesn't say that, I hear people all the time say 4F doesn't apply to archaeological sites. That's not true. You are accepted from making an approval. So when we have the in-depth training, I'm going to really harp on language and, the right terminology and such. And at the end of the day, if we can get sued and we can lose on this substantive statute we want to make sure we say things correctly. We won't want to talk about the effects to a Section 4F resource. We want to talk about the uses of them. I digress. A lot of these exceptions we use all the time. The number one, the rehab, maintenance of historic facilities, the restoration of it. Again, depending on what the resource is and what our project is doing, we could maybe qualify for an exception. The archaeological sites one and number two, we use that a lot. And the bottom line, it comes down to, why is that site important? Is it important primarily under criterion D, which is for the information we can learn from it? Or is it important for some other criterion, A or some other that, and in most cases, archaeological sites are eligible from what we can learn from it. And if they are eligible primarily for that, and they don't warrant preservation in place, we qualify for the exception. So late designation is about when something is identified, depending on if you're in the NEPA process or in the right-of-way process or, on construction. So there's a lot of projects that we've had. I've worked on projects in every state, quite honestly. And there's projects that we've had where we're in construction and we find an archaeological site that we had done shovel testing on and just did not locate that particular piece of the site. We've had projects that, the historic significance of some resource changes, or a new type of species is listed, and all of a sudden there's a refuge with a species in it that wasn't there when we were developing our project. So there are ways to address those kinds of things. Temporary occupancy is the one I had mentioned earlier. There's a list of conditions that you have to satisfy. Your length of time you're on this property, what kind of restrictions, are you restricting the use of the facility? What are you doing within that land? What does, and there's a term out there, OWJ, the official with jurisdiction, think. So a good example of a temporary occupancy exception is where you have a trail that's under a bridge and you want to do a project to fix the bridge or replace the bridge. If we can limit our closure or find a way to get people around or up and over or this or that, obviously we don't want people going through underneath the bridge if we're going to be knocking it down and there's the potential for, someone to get injured. So the timing of our closure, we had a situation one time where the trail, we were pretty much right in the middle of the trail. And we made the argument that even if we closed it for 100% of the time, there were still 2 usable sections on either end. And we made a case that, because of that situation, we qualified for the temporary occupancy exception. I had a situation where the parking lot was on, the trailhead was on the south side of the bridge and the trail went under the bridge and, continued north. And that trailhead was like the only one in the area. And so if we wanted to totally close people getting under the bridge, that was going to be a problem. So when the contractor was out there doing grading work and this and that, we graded a site on the north side of the bridge and built a new temporary trailhead. And yeah, it cost some money, but that amount of money on that $15 million bridge replacement project probably translated to a lot less money than it would have, time and money that it would have cost us to go through an individual evaluation. So again, that's kind of my continuing message here. The park, the number 5, that's federal land stuff, and they pretty much have a blanket exception for anything they do. If you get involved in federal lands projects, call me offline and we can talk about that. Number 6, the trails, the paths, the bike. Those types of projects or regular road or bridge projects that potentially impact a trail, a bikeway, or a sidewalk should not be showstoppers. As long as we can find ways to replace them or maintain their continuity, again, that exception is used all of the time. And then again, the very last one, transportation enhancement and mitigation. You're building a trail in a park. That's what this exception is. You should not have to spend 6 to 12 months trying to comply with 4F because you want to build a trail through a park because the park wants that trail. So it's about compiling the right information and getting the input from the right persons and documenting that so you can present something that says, yes, we meet this exception because we've checked, boxes 1 through 6. I'm gonna pause for a moment. So anything in the chat pod, anybody? So I said it earlier because I got everybody on mute. If you've got questions or comments or thoughts, please put them in the chat pod and I'll continue to check in on those and see how it's going there. All right, so if we don't qualify for the exceptions, if we're unable to take this first slip ramp to the left, then the first thing we want to look at is, can we make the case that our project has a minor use of this resource? And again, that's what de minimis means. Came out in 2005, like I said, and you can apply de minimis to any type of project. It can be a widening, it can be an intersection, it can be a bridge, it can be a CE, an EA, or an EIS for those that know the environmental levels of documentation. So, some of the other stuff that preceded this, you had certain only widening along existing, or only something that wasn't an EIS kind of thing. But de minimis is very different than some of the other non-individual compliance options. The second bullet is extremely important. We look at the net effect after mitigation. So if I am taking some land, but I'm replacing that land somewhere else, if I'm impacting some landscaping, but I'm, doing and replanting landscaping to minimize visual effects, or to, do whatever, net effect after mitigation. So we'll look at some examples to illustrate this a little more. But the bottom line with this one, if I can stay in that realm that it's only a minor use of the resource, then I do not have to go to looking at avoidance alternatives. I do not have to justify that. Are there any feasible and prudent avoidance alternative? And that, again, I reiterate, that was a big change. The approvals come from the FHWA division office. I know that back in 2005, when this provision was enacted, I was just leaving the Georgia division and going to work more nationally for Federal Highway. But there was a point in time where Georgia processed more de minimis impact findings than any other state in the nation. If we're able to do that, there's a whole lot of things I'm going to touch on later about individuals where you have to do circulation, you have to do a draft and a final, you have to do a public hearing, you have to do legal sufficiency. None of that applies if we can stay in this de minimis realm. So a couple of examples, again, our two big 4F protected resources. Historic sites is the first one. So in the bottom left quadrant of this graphic, you have the Jones Farm, which is a historic property. you've got some buildings there, and you see a boundary that is in the hashed area, and we want to do some type of improvement along State Route 55, the north-south route, and we're going to, proposing to take a little strip take of land from the historic property. Maybe it's a shoulder widening or whatever, a center turn lane. In order for us to be able to say it's de minimis for a historic site, we've got a couple of criteria that, like I said earlier, historians go through a process called the Section 106 process, which is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. But you end up with one of three findings: either a no historic properties affected, a no adverse effect, or an adverse effect. In order for us to say that it's minor, we have to get one of those first two. We have to stay under that no adverse effect threshold. And again, we do that all the time. If it's just a little bit of land, or, it's not taking a building, it's not taking any significant landscape features, it's not taking any type of walls or other features that contribute to that resource, we get no adverse effect determinations all the time. And if we make that determination, then we seek SHPO's concurrence. And if SHPO concurs, then we, inform SHPO that we're going to make our de minimis. And we have to also think about, is there any other parties that have input into that? Like, if you're doing a project in Savannah, you've got consulting parties that are going to want to give you their advice. But again, we do this project all the time. All right, I see some questions. One of them I could have talked about with the trail. Let me just pause with those. Let me get through de minimis for parks. We'll take a short break because it's almost been an hour already, and then I'll come back to the question. So for those of you that put it in there, I'm just give me a few more minutes then. Okay, so for parks, when we're talking about the parks and the recreation areas and the refuges, man, we don't have this companion Section 106 process. There's not a similar process for parks. So to say a use of a Parks Plus resource is minor, we have to meet this first bullet, that it doesn't adversely affect the activities, features, and attributes that qualify the resource for protection. We have to get concurrence from the official with jurisdiction, and we have to afford the public an opportunity to review and comment. So the OWJ, sometimes, it's a challenge just to figure out who that is. Sometimes it's the mayor, sometimes it's a Parks and Rec director. At the end of the day, it's who controls what happens on that park. And when we're consulting with those folks, we want to speak to them about what this first bullet says, that, okay, here's your park, here's our project. Do you agree we're not adversely affecting the resource? And that's how the discussion should be grounded. I have people tell me, well, they won't concur that it's de minimis. They don't need to. We make a de minimis call. SHPO doesn't need to concur it's de minimis. SHPO deals in adverse effects and 106 issues. FHWA makes 4F compliance determinations. So, I had projects where people say, well, the tribe won't sign the de minimis agreement. Well, the tribe's not going to sign it because they told me they don't understand what it means. And, I very much understand that stance. But again, speak to people in the language that you need to, and get them to concur in or give you input on, the things that you need to, and then you use that information to make the right decision. I'm sort of getting down into the weeds for some of the environmental stuff. I apologize for that. It's hard for me to not get very excited about talking about 4F and get down in the weeds. But so let's the thing about public involvement or public opportunity. I've had projects where the mayor says that park's not significant, it's not important, and you go out there on a Saturday and you can't even get in the parking lot because there's so many people wanting to get into the park. Sometimes local governments want to drive alternatives, and again, the right way to do it is to go through the process, and we have the ability and responsibility to make sure what the locals are saying is appropriate. So here's my example. We'll go through this couple of parks things and we'll take a quick break. So the road on the south side of the graphic, there's a red, this is a right-of-way, existing right-of-way boundary. You can see then the blue line is the park boundary. And then inside the blue line, there's a black dash line, which is the fence that's around the park. And we want to do some type of improvement to that east-west road at the bottom of the graphic, right? The houses that are there, they're just normal residences. They're not any kind of historic resources or anything like that. So here's this first project, and it takes land from the park. That you could say it's a 5 to 10 foot strip take. Since we're within that park boundary, we are using that 4F protected resource. We are not touching the fence. Let's do a little voting thing. So use if you think it's de minimis, give me a thumbs up in the chat pod or on your screen. If you think it's not de minimis, give me a thumbs down if it's more than a minor use of the resource. I saw a couple thumbs pop up. I would say in this instance, yes. It's a strip take. It doesn't appear like there's any kind of significant landscaping or this or that. Remember, we're talking about net effect after mitigation. So maybe we need to regrade it, again, depending on how close to the fence we're getting. Maybe the fence is not in a great condition. Maybe we would consider replacing that fence and moving it a little bit further away from the edge of pavement. But again, this one, is something that we would do pretty regularly with a minor impact, a minor use of that resource. There's probably some smart people out there that might say something about, well, what about the driveway to the parking lot, right? So, obviously that's something we would have to address. We'd have to be able to allow access to the park during our project, or if we had to, maybe we provide a different access over here somewhere on the right-hand side and create a different driveway off of a side street here. But again, net effect after mitigation in the rural world, this is probably a de minimis project every day of the week. I'm gonna take our pause right there. So I got 10:58. So I'll give you 10 minutes. So at 8 minutes after 11, I'm going to start talking again. So we're on break for 10 minutes.